All right, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Today we have a special guest, Jawanza Malone from Kenwood, Oakland community organization. It's located on the Chicago South Side. COCO's legacy as the oldest Black-led membership-based community organization in Chicago is a result of organizing low-income and working families around issues most critical to their daily lives. Jawanza brings over 27 years of organizing and community-based leadership development experience to his role. Joining COCO in 1997 as a board member, Jawanza later moved into a staff role where he led the organization's housing justice work. In 2012, Jawanza rose into the executive role and began guiding the organization towards its current stature as Chicago's progressive frontline fighting back regressive policies that continue to negatively impact the quality of life for the working people of Chicago and across the state of Illinois. Jawanza is currently focused on two critical campaigns: winning a community benefits agreement for the Obama Presidential Center, and for Illinois to become the next state to repeal the statewide prohibition on rent control and establish rent regulations through the Lift the Ban Coalition. His campaign and leadership is elevating COCO's local policy influences to regional and national levels. Jawanza's background in community organizing and programming development has led him to work in both the public and private sectors, philanthropy, and communities on 5 continents. He's received a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and the Master of Arts degree in community counseling from the Illinois School of Professional Psychology at Argosy University. When warmer weather permits, Jawanza can be found enjoying a bike ride with his son Timothy along the Chicago lakefront. Jawanza seeks to live in accordance with the Kenyan proverb, treat the world well, for it was not given to you by your parents, it was lent to you by your children. And without further ado, we have Jawanza. Thank you for joining us today. Quickly, I kind of introduced you, but if there's anything else you'd want to add, if there's anything else you'd want to add to that.
No, thank you for the invitation and for me to have this time with you. You said it. I like to think of myself as a student of organizing. I feel that community organizing is as much an art as it is a science. And so really trying to just understand how to influence the world is something that I take seriously. I believe that community organizing is the only way that change is being created from time immemorial. So the second we start reading about people doing stuff, they were using organizing. And so I just take it seriously.
All right, so we're gonna start with first question. How does your organization, or how do you see your organization fitting into the larger social justice organizing scene in Chicago?
So you mentioned that we are the oldest grassroots base building community organizing group that's Black-led in Chicago. And so that by itself says a lot. We were founded in 1965. For 30 years, the organization was led by a member of the Congress of Racial Equality. So that connection with the civil rights movement isn't just something that's theoretical. It is tangible, it's real, it's part of who we are, as part of our legacy. For the Kenwood Oakland community itself, part of what people know of the community is a result of the work of the organization. We were responsible for bringing 300 units of affordable housing to the area. We built a free medical clinic. We built King High School, which is now known as King College Prep. Our work impacts the community as much as it impacts Chicago, Illinois, and beyond. You mentioned 2 of our campaigns. We just had a victory earlier this week where an ordinance to protect low-income and working families from being displaced in Woodlawn got passed by the city council. And so while that's obviously going to impact our community, it impacts so much more than just our community. And that's the way we approach our work. We live by the idea of thinking globally and acting locally. Sometimes the acting locally allows us to also act globally. A percentage of the staff has traveled abroad and worked in communities abroad, organizing. Shannon Bennett, the deputy director for COCO, was instrumental in making sure that the World Youth Forum of the United Nations system had a racial equity lens more than a decade ago. And so we're actually close to 2 decades ago now. And so this moment we're in where you have Black Lives Matter being on corporate websites, and you have, I would say the largest unrest, social unrest we've seen in this country in the past 5 decades, is something that we were born out of and sought to do in our own way for the last 20, 30 years. And so I would say that having that backdrop is something that informs our work. And so as we engage in the broader organizing community in Chicago, it is that sort of spirit or that philosophy, that understanding that we bring to the table. So for us, it is about centering the people most impacted. That is part of what it means to engage in community organizing. But sometimes, because groups are looking for the victory, that part can get overlooked, right? And so certain groups can come into an organizing campaign looking for the back door, right? How can we cut the deal to be able to exit this campaign as fast as possible? And if that means further marginalizing the people that are already marginalized, for them, it justifies the means that's used to get to the end goal. And that just is not our perspective. And so we often are the ones that take the hard lines, have clear transformative demands. We don't engage in transactional politics with our community or with others. For us, it really is about building solidarity, building relationships, and strengthening our communities.
Yeah, I definitely feel that definitely with the organizing that I've seen recently, it's definitely important. And I think more people are realizing the importance of uplifting those communities that are the most marginalized, instead of speaking out for them, kind of uplifting their own voices. So it's definitely something that I prescribe to. And I guess similar along the lines, I think you kind of already started to mention this, but I was taking a look at the mission statement for COCO, and it was just very obvious that the relationship between the organizers and the members was is extremely important, as you kind of mentioned. But if you could talk maybe a little bit more about kind of what is the relationship between the community organizers and the members? Are they often talking to them? Are there representatives? How does that work? What roles do people take on, I guess?
Sure. So I should say that our approach to organizing is really built on our tradition as Black people in this country. While Saul Alinsky is considered the grandfather, godfather, some father of organizing, we recognize that organizing existed before Saul Alinsky was born, right? And so while he looked at labor organizing and attempted to adopt it for a community-based context, we've been doing that since we were brought to this country. And as I mentioned in the beginning, community organizing is something that every community who has sought to change their condition has engaged in throughout time. So it is nothing that exists in a vacuum, right? While Saul Alinsky codified some of the things, right, created a bit of a lexicon. So you think about terms like self-interest, target, demand, right? These are things that sort of came out of his experience and the people who were working with him. But again, these things had previously existed. So I'm just bringing that up to make the point that while we engage in organizing and utilize the terms that Alinsky style organizers use, we at least feel are the tradition we come out of, we saw in action in the South. We saw in action during the abolitionist movement for slavery, right? We saw this in action when you looked across the ocean and you saw power changing hands, right? It doesn't change. And the basic fundamental foundation upon which all organizing takes place is relationships. If you do not have solid relationships, you're not going to have solid change. And some of this we're experiencing now, right? Where the things we fought for, we're losing because the people who fought for them didn't have the relationship with future generations to help kind of keep these things going, to help people understand the value, right? To understand that the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were won, but don't assume that these things also can't be lost. And so for us, as people come into the organization, we recognize oftentimes they're coming into the organization not because of a pamphlet that someone read, right? Or because they like our logo on a t-shirt. They're coming into the organization because they see something in somebody else who's in the organization. And it is through that connection that they want to build a relationship. And as that relationship is strengthened, they begin to realize that they have given their power, their individual power, to other people who mean them harm. And so what they have to do at a fundamental level is regain their power and utilize that power in a way that they see fit to create the world that they want to realize. And that is done in partnership with others. We make a clear and stark contrast between organizers and activists. Activists are people who are the lone wolves, right? They get fire in their belly and they go out and they want to do something about it. Organizers, by contrast, get that fire in their belly and recognize that they have to get other people to work with them, right? And so it is about building those relationships, person by person, community by community, to create change.
For sure. I definitely think that's something to hammer down for the people who will be viewing this later, who might not even understand that difference between the activist and the organizer. I think it's something that I subconsciously knew, but I had never really thought about differentiating the two, and kind of just hammering home how community organizing is definitely different than other forms of advocacy, since there are so many different kinds. But since I've joined the community organizing realm, I definitely, that passion that I've had, that fire that I've had has definitely been matched by other people. And it also is, you don't feel like you have to do it by yourself. I think that's another point that I've seen, because there have been in my hometown, when I wanted to do something, I definitely felt like I kind of had to do it by myself. And as soon as I joined the community organizing realm in Chicago, there were ideas that I came in having, finding out they've already been done or they're already being done. And I was like, oh, perfect. I can just go join them. Like, that's I think that's the beauty of community organizing, for sure. So I definitely feel that. You definitely were talking about like housing and what you've been doing, the community campaigns you've been doing this summer, but how has all that been impacted by the pandemic?
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard people in all sorts of places talk about how COVID has exposed um, the fractures that exist in the society, right? The very real impact of systemic structural racism, and how our communities are the most vulnerable communities in this country. And while that's true, I think what is also true, and I think what is implicit in that statement is that these things have always been there.
Oh, definitely.
This isn't new, right? And so while this pandemic is a new stressor on the system, the fact that, in Chicago, 70% of the people who died from a viral infection are Black. In St. Louis, I think that number has changed, but at least in the beginning of the recognized pandemic, 100% of the people who had died were Black um, from a viral infection. And so when you think about that for a second, what is it that can cause a viral infection to kill people and to exclusively kill Black people in St. Louis mean for our society? And the point that I've attempted to make, and others who are way more articulate than I am have attempted to make, is that the pre-existing conditions that we like to think about, right, and attribute to why Black people are feeling the brunt of this disease, obesity and hypertension and diabetes, and you name it. I think what we also have to think about are the pre-existing conditions in our society. Like, what are the illnesses that already exist in society? Um, so not physical illnesses, right, but the existential illnesses, right, the social ills. Because when a Black person goes to a hospital because they have symptoms of COVID, and they're told to go home and take some Robitussin, that's structural racism, right? When you have a white person who comes into that hospital exhibiting the same symptoms, whoever that doctor is, whoever that nurse is, whoever that intake person is making the decision that values that white person's life over that Black person's life, right?
Yeah.
And says, well, this person may have insurance, this person doesn't, right? This person may be able to make it if they get treatment. This other person is just going to go do something else that's going to cause them to die anyway, right? There's these, people talk about bias, right? And the role that bias plays in interpersonal reactions. But this is way more than bias, right? Because that bias is now backed up by systems. And when those systems back up that bias, the people who end up losing out are Black people. In Illinois, the Governor J.B. Pritzker, is implemented a stay-at-home order, right? So declared a disaster, was empowered with what's called emergency powers, and began to establish executive orders. Towards the end of March, he told people to stay home, told businesses to close their doors. The state had to lock down to contain this disease that was ravaging communities. About three to 4 weeks ago, an article was released that said that 50% of the businesses that closed will be unable to reopen.
Wow.
They will not reopen because of the lost revenue. And I don't need to tell you, the majority of that 50% are businesses owned by Black people or people of color by extension. And so when you think about the 780,000 people across the state who've been unable to pay rent, you think about the 1.5 million people who filed unemployment claims. You think about the people whose lives have been turned upside down in this moment.
Yeah.
Where's the recovery plan for them? we've been pushing the governor to cancel rent and mortgage payments for the duration of the stay-at-home order and the 3 months following. So retroactively just canceled that debt for people. Because when you think about it, the people who lost their jobs, people who lost their businesses, where are they going to go to recoup that money? If they do get hired back, and in a lot of cases, people will not be hired back from their former employer. If they do get hired back, that low wage they were earning is not going to give them enough money to be able to pay 4 months back rent, 5 months back rent, 6 months back rent. And so while they were barely able to pay rent to begin with, working paycheck to paycheck, now they have this multi-month debt just hanging over them that they will never be able to pay. And so what do you do with that? If the mayor of this city, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, canceled rent for the businesses at the airports because they weren't getting business. The U.S. bankruptcy court said that businesses do not have to pay the full rent to their landlord because they were not operating their business. So if businesses can get bailed out, why is it the people who are already vulnerable in the first place cannot get bailed out, right? And so I'm saying all that to say that our work, while we've attempted to maintain it, and it wasn't easy, right? When we were told to stay home, we had momentum that had been built around two campaigns that we wanted to figure out how to maintain, right? The city council stopped meeting, the state legislature stopped meeting. We had bills in Springfield, we had ordinances in Chicago that we wanted to advance because of the impact it would have on our community. And so we took to digital media. We had to figure out how to utilize digital organizing tools to stay engaged with our people and continue to build that momentum. But in the midst of all this, people's lives have been turned upside down. And so while we were advocating for rent control to stabilize communities in Chicago because so many people have been displaced just because their housing cost has gone up while their wages have remained stagnant, we had to shift, right? To recognize that it's not just about people having a reasonable rent. People can't pay any rent, right? And so it is what we do as a community-based organization. We're engaging people every single day. And so we have to keep our finger on the pulse of the community to, one, stay relevant, but to also make sure people are getting what they need. It doesn't do us any good to have a good reputation and our communities not being served. And so that was a really long-winded answer to your question, Jackson, but it's just, these are trying times. I mean, I was at a press conference yesterday to protest the proposed closure of Mercy Hospital. And, just made the point, what has 2020 been for us? Right? In Detroit, they set up a memorial for lives lost due to COVID. They had something like 1,100 pictures spread out along the road so family members could mourn the dead because they weren't able to have a funeral. What is this moment for us? And I think there at some point, we really have to take stock of what is happening to Black people in this country and how has that shifted over time. There's a statistician that has argued when you look at the indicators of health, and we're talking health in general, right? So social, economic, political, not just physical. But you look at the health of our communities, we are worse off than we were at the beginning of the civil rights movement. That says something. And so while our work we've sought to maintain what our work has been, there are some very real things that we've had to adjust to.
Sure, sure. You definitely hit on the whole the rent and the housing point. I definitely wanted to make sure we got to that. Another big topic that's been, I guess, especially now that it's like September, is youth and education. I know people have started back up at school. We're starting up in a couple weeks. And I've seen that you guys have done work with different schools. You talked about King. I know Chase had mentioned about diet, but could you talk a little bit about your work with diet, just so people know what you guys have done?
Yeah. I feel like I'm the old dude who keeps telling these war stories. But I mean, I believe, yeah, I'm a student of history, and so I believe to understand today, you got to understand what happened yesterday. Um,
Absolutely.
and so for diet, diet is a really interesting story. Um, so back in 1999, Chicago Public School Administration decided to make King High School a selective enrollment school. So it became King College Prep. They began to phase out the student population, which means that they didn't accept any new student classes. They just wanted to graduate out the last class. So as freshmen became sophomores, became juniors, became seniors, that was the final class in the school. Because they were converting King to a selective enrollment school, they needed someplace else in the neighborhood, in the general vicinity, where students who couldn't test into King could go. Which, when you think about it, like, we're talking about public education. Like, why should you have to test
And
to get into the school literally across the street from your home? But that's a whole nother thing. And so, in looking for another school, they decided to convert Diet, which was a middle school, to a high school. And according to the principal, she found out that her school, which was literally one of the top middle schools in the city, you had parents from all over the city trying to get their child into Diet because it was such a really good middle school. They had a cohort model where, as one class entered, whoever their teachers were stayed with them throughout their remaining year. So they didn't get a different set of teachers. And so you imagine, just going back to relationships, right? That
yeah,
relationship that's built between that teacher and student, how nurturing and affirming that can be over a 3 year period, right? And so that's what happened there. And so she found out that her school was going to convert from a middle school to a high school the same time everybody else did, through a newspaper article. And so if you pause there, right, the principal of the school finds out from essentially her boss the exact same time the broader public finds out, and this happened at the end of the school year. So in June, you find out in September, you're going to now become a high school and start taking your freshman class of students. So you have a summer to convert your entire operation from a middle school operation to a high school operation. Structural racism, right? Those N words don't matter, right? Do whatever it is you want because they don't matter. They just got to deal with it, right? And so at that point, we were like, this don't feel right, because we had programming in King as a high school. And so as we find out, okay, we got to shut down our programming because they're phasing the school out. And literally, young people who live across the street, who were planning to go across the street to high school, now got to figure out someplace else to go. We're like, this don't feel right. And as we began to dig and dig, it wasn't right. And when the first graduating class from Diet walked across the stage and attempted to enter college in 2003, they were not prepared.
yeah,
They just weren't. right? They had not had a single advanced placement or college prep class. The books in the library were basically the same middle school books that had been there. They had not had a librarian, right? They did not have any of the things you would expect a high school to have to prepare those young people for college or beyond. And it was at that point we said, this ain't right. And we began to work with the community to wrap our arms around the school. And it took a while, but we were able to really help turn that school around. We made sure that that school began to get the resources and the attention that it needed. And so what happened was for 2 consecutive years, I believe it was 2007 and 2008, you saw diet have the highest decrease in out of school suspensions and arrests and the highest increase in students going to post-secondary institutions. It was working. The restorative justice program that had been implemented there had won a national award. ESPN invested $4 million to completely renovate the gymnasium because of what they saw happening at that school. In 2011, the Chicago Board of Education decided to phase out the school, to again stop admitting students and to just close the school. There was no way we were going to allow that to happen with all the work that we had put into the school. But to their credit, it was the young people themselves who threw the first punch. Some of our youth leaders who were connected to the youth work we were doing at the school, youth leadership development activities, came into the office one day and said, we need to do something about our school. We can't just let them close it. And as we do, we said, what are you going to do about it then? Right? Like, you know what to do. You big and bad. What are you going to do? And so they were the ones who began to hold press conferences in front of the school. They were the ones who got their fellow students and their teachers to stand with them to oppose the closure of their school. We worked with them to draft civil rights complaints that were filed with the U.S. Department of Education saying that the closure of diet and the treatment of the students as they prepared to close the school violated their civil rights. And the U.S. Department of Education opened an investigation into the claims of civil rights abuses taking place at diet. All that led to a 34-day hunger strike where parents, grandparents, and community allies literally starved themselves for 34 days to demand that the school be reopened. And it was. And for the first time in history, we had a school reopened after the board had closed it, and it be an open enrollment school, not a charter school, not a contract school, but an open enrollment neighborhood school that went back into that building. They invested something around $14 million to renovate the facility and also to reinfuse a new academic focus into the school. And so we've been there every step of the way. We now have programming in the school. We were able to advocate for a model, a community-driven model for school transformation, referred to as sustainable community schools, that was implemented at Diet. So there's a community advisory council that determines what happens with the school budget and identifies programming and activities to improve the student outcomes at the school. And right now, Diet is a top performing school in Chicago. Drake Elementary is another, is an elementary school where we also have the sustainable community school model being implemented. So we are advocates for education because we recognize education for our community has never just been about education. it has been a track towards so-called upward mobility. It has been the way our communities have sought to transform itself to make sure that our needs get met.
Yeah, I definitely think that's an important point to make. I think while you were talking, I was thinking about the stat you were talking about earlier with before they had shut it down with the decrease in out of school suspensions and stuff like that, or arrests or things like that. And it's just to hammer home the point that when the youth have the correct resources, like how much they can do, or even the fact that you talked about they were the ones who took the first punch. Uh, that's definitely been something that I've seen a lot this summer, is talking about when uh, our communities have the right resources. Like, look at all the things that we can actually do. And I've usually seen that in when people are talking about like policing, and for example, when they're saying like these communities need to be policed because they're dangerous, and it's like, well, if they actually have the right resources, if they actually have the right opportunities, then we can do things ourselves. We can thrive.
That's right.
For sure. And I guess that's another thing that I wanted to briefly hit on, was the whole kind of Black Lives Matter protests, and a lot of there's been a lot of like defund the police campaigns and stuff like that. So what has Coco done to be involved in those things this summer?
Sure. So again, going back a little bit, those young people who said, what about our school? They were some of the young people who initially did the research, again, a decade ago now, that looked at the disparity between how budgets were allocated um, between schools in our community versus schools in more affluent communities. And so we're looking, comparing public school to public school, right?
Yes.
But when you have a public school, let's say in Lakeview High School, which was, blocks away from the former mayor's home, compared to Diet, school we were just talking about, um, there was similarity in how much money was allocated to the school. But the biggest difference was how that money got spent and what line item that money was appropriated towards. So at Lakeview, the money was allocated for curriculum and instruction, right? They had darkroom photography as an elective course in high school, right? They had something like 3 different world language classes, compared to Diet, which had to be forced to take physical education as an online course. Art was an online course, right? So you got darkroom photography, right? Where you got a dark room, right? And photographic film that you're developing, compared to drawing stuff on a computer, right? And so the reality was, the money in our school was determined by central office, and the majority of it went towards quote unquote safety and security. And so our schools get safety and security money, their schools get curriculum and instruction money. So what do you think is going to happen in terms of educational outcomes? How is that student going to be prepared? You got one student who's been policed for 4 years, and you have another student who's been educated for 4 years. What do you expect that child to be able to do once they graduate? And so for us, that was the travesty. And it was, again, the research of these young people that called that out. And so this notion of divest, invest isn't new, but it's important. And again, in this moment where we're looking at the chickens coming home to roost, we realize how important it is to not police people, but to educate people, right? Not to shoot people when they're undergoing mental duress, but to make sure that there are services available to help them heal from the trauma they have experienced in their lives. And so for us, that's what this is about. right? When people say defund the police, what they're saying is, why is it 40% of the city's budget is spent on policing? And you have 1% that's going on healthcare, right? You have 3% that's going on education. If you prepare people to be able to live their lives and know that their expenses are going to be taken care of, they're going to spend their time differently than if they don't know where they're going to sleep from one night to the next. The data bears out the people who are involved in violent criminal activity in this city are homeless. So again, right, let's just look at the facts. If one of the major determinants for someone's propensity for violent criminal activity is whether or not they have a home, yeah, where do we need to be investing our dollars? Is it to lock people up when they do something wrong? Or should it be making sure they have a home so they aren't motivated to do something to find a home?
Yeah.
It's common sense.
It makes so much sense.
And while I completely understand people's reticence to eliminate the police, right? The idea of having some lifeline, like if something goes left, right, you can call somebody. I completely understand that. But when we look at the data, if the money that we pay into the system, because again, they're dealing with our money, right? Their budgets are based on how much money comes from our pockets, right? If our money is not being used to provide us with our needs, there's something fundamentally wrong with that picture. How is it we have 4 hospitals that we're talking about closing in the middle of a global pandemic that were all in the Black community? So you have Mercy, you had St. Bernard, you had Advocate, you had Roseland, who were saying, we aren't making it. We're going to have to close. And at the same time, the mayor of this city invests $17 million or whatever the dollar figure was to create a hospital at McCormick Place. You got Black hospitals that are saying, we are struggling. Help us. And instead of resources going there, they're like, you know what? We need a hospital. Let's build one at McCormick Place. They're not using it. And it's something, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but like a few dozen people actually went to be taken care of at McCormick Place. So you had an investment of $17 million to serve a handful of people. But again, it goes back to the fact that we aren't valued, our communities aren't valued, and while we can paint Black Lives Matter on the street, when it comes to decision makers and public policy, Black lives don't matter there.
That's definitely what I've seen this summer. I mean, I've grown up like right outside of Philadelphia, and I live on right outside where it's very interesting, like border that I live on, because I live in the city of Philadelphia is on one side, the affluent suburb is like on the other side. So it's very interesting seeing that conversation and those points that you just laid out in those two different spaces. Even when it comes to that whole idea of the policing and the divest, invest, and all these other things, it's even down to protests themselves, going to a protest in the suburbs versus a protest in the city, and seeing how the people who attend those, how they react, their thoughts about, because of course I go to them, I like to probe people, I like to see what they're thinking, and just the difference between the two has been very drastic, and kind of just that, from what you were saying, just that brought up some things to me. So I have like two more questions. One, I guess it's kind of like a multi-question, but like, what are some of the personal takeaways and lessons that you've kind of had from your work, and maybe like some misconceptions about your work that you want to clear up?
Those are two good questions. I would say I guess there's two key takeaways. One, that it is all about the personal transformation of individual people. It is through helping people become their best selves that we create a pathway to realize better communities and a better country. It is not in a sort of self-help kind of way, right? But it is really helping people play a role in their own liberation. We're not going to do this by having some charismatic leader speaking truth to power. Words will always just be words. As powerful as they are to motivate, to inspire, to challenge our thinking, they're still just words. It requires action to create change. And that is only done when people feel they have the power and believe they can create change. That's what this work is about for me. The second thing is something that Frederick Douglass said years ago, right? Power conceives nothing without a demand. And so being able to drink from the same water fountain, being able to eat in the same restaurants, being able to date who you want does not change the condition of our people in this country. Those are cosmetic changes, right? It is akin to putting a porcelain veneer over rotten teeth, right? It looks good, but it's still corroded on the inside. And so the only way our condition is going to change is if we figure out for ourselves what it is that we ultimately want, right? Do we actually want to sort of tweak the edges, right? To feel a little bit better about this gilded cage we're in? Or do we want to get rid of the cage? And it's a decision we have to make. And then, our actions are going to follow from there. But power conceives nothing without a demand. Just going back to kind of where you started, there are groups who go into creating organizing campaigns to answer the question, what is winnable, right? Like you think about, okay, we need this. We may only be able to win this, but from negotiation, what you end up getting is this. Look how far that is from what we actually need, right?
Yeah.
And so for us, it's not about identifying what's winnable. It's about identifying what's need and then fighting like cats and dogs to get what it is that we need. And the example I always use is the institution of slavery. Slavery was legal, right? It was profitable for a select few people. It was an institution that a war was fought over, right? And so the idea of the abolition of slavery is a preposterous notion when you think about it that way. But the reality was the US was engaged in human trafficking and they were benefiting from it. But who wasn't benefiting? Right? You have an entire continent that was destabilized from the rape and pillage of the people who lived there, right? So you have this geopolitical upheaval that took place because of the practice of human trafficking. And so the people who valiantly fought against that weren't fighting for what was winnable, right? Because what would have been winnable? Maybe treat them a little bit better on the holidays, right? Maybe not beat them as much, right? Maybe train the overseer to be a little bit nicer, right? When they catch the fugitive slave, maybe not beat them so bad, right? Give them due process, right? That might have been winnable, but they was like, nah, this has to end, and it did. And so for us, that's what it's about. We have to recognize what the root cause of our oppression is and get rid of it. And so that's what I learned. I think that the biggest fallacy I would want to help people demystify or debunk is that when you see cocoa in the street, it is usually after a series of attempted conversations, if not real conversations, where we've attempted to reason with whoever the decision makers are. And once things reach a point where we can go no further, that's when you see us in the street. And so you have people who say, well, Coco, they're just rebel rousers. They just show up in front of somebody's house and they're crazy and radical and non-strategic. And I mean, you'll hear all sorts of crazy things. You're like, yeah, I've heard that. But the reality is the system works because the people who benefit from the system work to maintain it. And so any challenge to that system is going to be met with opposition. And the only reason to challenge the system is because it's not working for us. And so those people who would oppose us trying to do right by our community, by the people that we work with, there's something wrong with that. And so if they feel uncomfortable because of their practice of oppression, then they should.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel like that's. I've heard that one a lot. That's why I was nodding when you were saying that they just, this group is just a bunch of rebels and they're just like they have no plans. I feel like a lot of people don't realize that there's a lot of behind the scenes work. I know, especially with like UChicago and working with Care Not Cops. A lot of people just think, they're doing this, they're got this protest, they're doing this. They're not even trying to do things the right way, whatever they believe that the right way is. Yeah. But then they don't realize the amount of times that we've tried to have public meetings with admin and we've done other things and we've had meetings with other important people in Chicago. And they just kind of assume because that's the only thing they see. They only see this one story. They see the single story. They don't see the full thing. And I asked the last question, kind of for advice for everybody, but I guess also for me, since this is kind of the work I want to do. What is that piece of advice or pieces of advice that you could give to someone who wants to engage in the work that you do?
To distill it down to one thing, I think I got to cheat a little bit. Maybe multi-part one thing. Yeah. I would say it starts with taking it serious. This isn't a thing where you can run out into the street with a sign and think that that's going to create change. That may be a part of it, right? But it will be like taking a single test and then expecting to graduate from school, right? Like, yeah, it's a part of it, but it's so much more. And so in taking it serious, it's the internal and the external work, right? It's to create change. We have to also be change at the same time. And so none of us are perfect, right? But we cannot perpetuate the oppression that we've experienced. And so that means we have to reprogram our brains. We have to reprogram how we think, how we talk, how we act, how we approach situations. There's a lot that this system has taught us, good and bad, right? But we have to be able to dissect what will lead us forward and what's holding us back. And so that's what I would say, right? To give it our all, to go in and do as much as we can in the way that we can, however we can, but just understand that it works both ways. It is both internal and external. That we have to be the change we want to see.
Well, thank you so much, Jawanza. I learned a lot. I hope everyone who watches learned something too, but I definitely enjoyed that conversation. So thanks again.